So today we are here with some of the folks who make up Abolish APD, which is a growing formation in Albuquerque that's bringing together different groups and organizations. So before we introduce everyone, I'll just have everyone introduce themselves and kind of talk a little bit about the work that they're doing. We'll start with David, go to Ernesto, and then finish with Selinda, and then we can have a broader conversation about some of the campaigns that are happening. So let's just start with David Correia, if you can introduce yourself, and the Abolish APD Coalition, and the three projects that you all are working on right now.
Sure. Thanks for having us, Nick. My name is David Correia. I'm one of the co-founders of a group called Abolish APD, which brings together organizers and activists and researchers focusing specifically on the history and contemporary pattern of violence at the Albuquerque Police Department. We formed fairly recently, about March, and the goal is to really create a laser-focused organization, an explicitly abolitionist organization to investigate the Albuquerque Police Department. So we have lawyers, quantitative social scientists, writers, activists and organizers engage in sort of a multi-pronged investigation of APD that I'll just briefly describe, and then we can go into more depth throughout the discussion. But the first part of it is street research. We're heading out onto the street in teams, talking to people in different areas of the city. We're selecting areas that are historically and to this day intensely and heavily policed. These are areas that, if you live in Albuquerque, you're familiar with. The International District, what cops call the war zone, south of downtown, and then in the area north of downtown leading to I-40 along the 4th Street corridor, where a lot of services are available for unsheltered folk. And what we're doing in the street is also engaging in mutual aid, water. We're distributing water and masks and food. The last 3 months have been brutal on the street. A lot of the services have been curtailed for people. It's difficult to get water. And so we're going around and we're distributing water and we're distributing masks and food. But we're also talking to people about the patterns of policing in the area. This is something that I've been involved in for many years. Nick, you and I did some street research back in 2014 and 2015. Partly at the time, the argument here was there's all these calls for reform. There's all these promises that reform will work. There's all these descriptions of what's wrong with APD, and none of it is ever based on research on the street. The people who are experiencing the bulk of the violence, and there's a lot of it, no one is asking any questions about what this pattern is. And so we're on the street talking to people about what is APD doing? How are they doing it? Who are they doing it to? What are their tactics? And how are they working? And I'll just say later we're going to talk a little bit about Operation Legend. And part of what we're hearing on the street is information related to Operation Legend that I think contradicts everything both the feds and city officials have claimed about it. So one focus of this is the street research and mutual aid that we've been doing for a little over a month now. Second part of it is to conduct research very specifically on the specific patterns visible in arrest and citation data by Albuquerque Police Department officers. I think it's all too often we get focused on the sort of exceptional, outrageous examples of police violence, the murders, the shootings, and we should. And Albuquerque police are among the most lethal in the United States. In fact, in 2014, Albuquerque police officers committed 21% of all homicides in the city. They routinely are rated among the most lethal police departments per capita in the United States. And every now and then those outrageous examples of police violence and the murders by police officers, such as in 2014 with James Boyd, or the 4 people killed already this year, result in sort of, outrage and in the streets and people coming into the streets. But there's less familiarity and there's less knowledge about the everyday harassment, brutality, and violence by APD cops that is often not lethal, but tears through communities and produces an incredible amount of insecurity and anxiety, not just by people on the street, although I think for the most part, they bear the brunt of most of this, but everybody who comes into contact with APD, particularly poor people of color, for whom APD targets. So, and I think Ernesto will probably talk more about that. He's really spearheaded that focus, looking through traffic citation data and the escalation of traffic citations into bench warrants and even incarceration, and the cascading effects in people's lives and communities for that pattern. He's been also looking at other arrest data. APD has really taken advantage of the pandemic and refuses all requests for information now, but we've been able to go through the courts to get a lot of this information. And we've seen some patterns that we'll talk about today, patterns that I think no one talks about. No reporters in town or no outlets have investigated this. People probably are not familiar with what these patterns mean and how they operate and how they criminalize people and trap people in the system. That's been a second focus of our work. And then the third part of our work, which is really something we're just starting to get involved in, is building a coalition of abolitionist groups in Albuquerque to target police and prisons. That's not something that we are solely responsible for, and that's not something that we take any credit for, but it's a goal of Abolish APD to participate in the forming of a broad-based coalition that is explicitly abolitionist and specifically focused on police and prisons in Albuquerque and Bernalillo County and New Mexico. That's not to say that we solve any problems by just abolishing police in this city or this state, but it is to say that I think if you look at places like in Minneapolis, that spent 6 years organizing on the ground very explicitly around doing abolitionist work, they were prepared to confront police in those moments of crises in a more organized, effective way than we have been in Albuquerque. There hasn't, unfortunately, the Albuquerque Police Department and reformists in general, particularly liberals, contributed to really hollowing out those efforts after 2014. And so there really has not been the kind of work on the ground. And so we know if we're going to successfully abolish police, we have to be organized and we have to do the hard work on the ground. And so our contribution is in publishing that information based on our investigations. We just published one today, which analyze, and we can talk a little bit about that. Mm-hmm. We've published 2 so far, and we can talk a little bit about that, so that we can start building and contributing to the building of a movement that results in abolishing APD. And let me just finish before passing it on to someone else that our name, Abolish APD, is not aspirational; it's a prediction.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, David. And let's, I think with that, let's move to Ernesto, if you want to just introduce yourself and the work that you're doing with Abolish APD, especially around police and policing data that David had mentioned.
Okay. Well, my name is Ernesto Longa. I'm also a co-founder of the Abolish APD. And my focus with the campaign thus far has really been to focus on data collection to develop a concrete picture of what policing by the Albuquerque Police Department really looks like in our community. The president of the police union, Sean Willoughby, reported recently that in 2019, APD had 1.5 million contacts. 1.5 million contacts, that's roughly 3 contacts per person in the city of Albuquerque. And we know that there are many people in Albuquerque who never have any contact with the police. And so we know also where a lot of that contact disproportionately falls. So in order to develop a sort of concrete picture of policing in Albuquerque, we've sought to really examine interactions between the police and members of our community. We've sought to do this by examining first traffic stops. So in traffic stops, we know that the city of Albuquerque last reported that in 2018, they made 44,142 traffic stops. Our study simply looks at 1,000 stops, the first 1,000 actually filed with the Metro Court here in Albuquerque.
In 2020.
In 2020, that's correct. Now, a couple comments about the data set are important to sort of qualify and better understand what we're looking at. This data set does not include parking tickets. It doesn't include DWIs. It doesn't include citations for people pulled over driving on revoked licenses that are DWI related. And it doesn't include any citations that people received that were not contested. So what we're really looking at are citations that were contested and make it into the courts. Now, I had submitted this record request with APD, and they told me, ask the courts. But by the way, point worth noting right now, the Albuquerque Police Department qualifies all record requests as excessively burdensome and indicates that it'll take 45 to 60 days minimum to respond to them. So we sought to...
Is that because of COVID-19?
I think that's fair. I think that's certainly the excuse that they're offering, that it's COVID-related, that is preventing them from being able to fulfill record requests. But thus far, we've not received any records in response to our record requests, and we've been filing them all summer. But just related to the traffic stops data set, we examined 1,000 stops made by APD, and they issued in these 1,000 stops 1,967 citations. Of those citations, or from those 1,000 stops, 186, or nearly 20% of the stops, resulted in bench warrants for arrest. And nearly 40% of these bench warrants remain outstanding. So people are out there with the threat of arrest hanging over them based on a speeding ticket or failure to properly display your registration or broken taillight, matters of that sort. 20% of the warrants that were cleared once issued were done so by what the courts refer to as jail in lieu of fines and fees. So,
Debtor's prison.
Yeah, essentially debtor's prison, people being picked up on an outstanding warrant and made to sit in jail for a couple days in lieu of the fines that they incurred from the traffic citations. So most of these citations we found were issued for actually matters related to registration, expired registration, matters related to insurance, and then speeding. And let's see what we found on some of that. Nearly half of all citations for suspended licenses, for example, resulted in bench warrants. And approximately 40% of the citations for no insurance resulted in bench warrants. Now, you may be wondering about the impact on people by race in traffic stops, but unfortunately, the state of New Mexico does not require uniform traffic citations to record or capture the race of the driver. So in very few of these records is race provided. So that's basically what we've looked at thus far in terms of the traffic stops. And one of the data points that we've collected is the location of all these stops. And we plan on plotting all of the locations for these 1,000 interactions on a map to get a feel for how dispersed the issuance of traffic citations are. I guess arguably location of stop could serve as a proxy for race in some way, but
well, definitely like by neighborhood, because obviously Albuquerque is a segregated city by class, and many neighborhoods are different in income level, and also the allocation of for example, where I live, it's a historically Black community, in South Broadway, or if you're in the Heights, it's a different kind of socioeconomic class system. But do you have any ideas, like just preliminary about like these things, or have you not examined the locations yet?
Oh no, I mean we've gathered all the location data for these 1,000 stops. We just have yet to plot it. Mm-hmm. And my general impression was that it wasn't necessarily concentrated in certain areas, but I think it's I think part of the challenge is that the data set doesn't include anything that arises into like a criminal offense. So if you get pulled over for a stop and it ends up being something besides a simple traffic infraction, then you end up in misdemeanor court or some other court. These are just purely stops that were limited to citations for simple traffic infractions. So the reality of traffic stops as pretext to search vehicles, right, to get at other matters is not really captured in this data, because if these traffic stops that result in misdemeanor citations or arrests or worse are found in other court records somewhere else. So we don't have a good picture of that yet.
And this is an ongoing investigation by Abolish APD, but we are publishing the first report based on this work, probably, I would think, Wednesday or Thursday of this week, and to discuss specifically one of the findings that we based on this evidence, which is that the most common citations that escalate into warrants are the citations that require you to have some sort of financial means to operate a motor vehicle. So, for example, insurance, affording a license, and affording registration. The people who more frequently get cited for those things, meaning they're having difficulty or can't afford the costs of owning and operating an automobile, are also cited, and those fines escalate because if you can't afford to pay for your insurance, you can't afford to pay for those fines. And so the story we're going to be releasing Wednesday or Thursday is an analysis of how the financial burden of owning and operating an automobile becomes a way for APD to criminalize those behaviors, resulting at times in incarceration, particularly for people who can't or don't pay their fine. That's just a small piece of what we're doing in this investigation, but that's the one we're going to be publishing this week.
So I'll just share some preliminary results from the next sort of data set that we're creating, and this has to do with misdemeanor citations and summons and arrests. Thus far, I've looked at 664 misdemeanor cases. Again, these are the first 664 filed in the year 2020 in Metro Court. These 664 cases have produced charges on 1,056 offenses. And most of this is for criminal trespass and shoplifting. 207 charges of criminal trespass, 157 charges of shoplifting, 94 charges of what I'll call, what I'll lump together as failure to obey, resisting, and concealing one's identity. And then 70 related to driving on a revoked license, that's DWI related. Interestingly, roughly 140 of these misdemeanor interactions are at big box stores. Walmart by far accounts for the most arrests in this category, 87 interactions. Target, Kohl's, Home Depot, then another 100 or so interactions at Walgreens, grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations, and parks. Now, 179 of these arrests at the time of interaction have occurred. And then of those who weren't, and then 348 of these 664 interactions, that's 52% result in warrants for arrest. So that's an incredible number in my opinion. 160 of these warrants are still outstanding. And then of those cleared, 80% of them are cleared by jail time. So the numbers dramatically climb when we go into the misdemeanor realm. For many times, these criminal trespasses are just identified as standing near a no trespass sign, sitting near a no trespass sign, camping somewhere, squatters. I mean, these are the kinds of people being dragged into jail and being summoned, failing to appear, and then having being saddled with warrants for their arrest.
I mean, you've identified documents, Ernesto, arrested for spitting on the sidewalk, arrested for leaning up against the side of a grocery store, right?
Absolutely. Littering, spitting, jaywalking, offenses like that will get you a misdemeanor citation, and as indicated, many of them result in warrants for arrest. Now, and
by the way, can I just say this confirms everything we're hearing on the street. Everyone we talk on the street describes this pattern: the constant harassment around loitering, trespassing, littering, the sort of warrants, the constant warrant checks and ID checks. And so and you found that too in the data when we look at citations for APD. Like, this is the kind of broken windows policing that APD says they don't do anymore, but that's really the bulk of the work that APD does, harassing people.
Absolutely. This data set, I think, probably more than any, captures the day-to-day grinding harassment of people on the streets and people living in poverty. So with this data set, we hope to compile a minimum of 1,000 cases. I'm about 2/3 of the way through this data set. In this instance, I have better race data. It's incredibly difficult to compile race data because you have to oftentimes go beyond the case file and search by the defendant's name throughout the entire court system to find any case that has actually identified the race of the person. But I've been successful in compiling race data for 72% of the cases thus far. And I can tell you that the numbers that really stand out are the numbers for African Americans and Native Americans, all of which are being apprehended for misdemeanor violations at a rate of about 4 to 5 times their actual number in the population.
Wow.
So that confirms something that many of us have heard as being true elsewhere. So that's the misdemeanor arrest data set. We're hoping to compile a similar data set for felony arrests, look at DWI arrests. And then we submitted several large batch record requests with APD, one for the 2019 SWAT deployment data and all use of force data since the adoption of their most recent use of force policy at the beginning of this year, where they're really tasked with producing a tremendous amount of paperwork by their own account. So we're looking to hold their feet to the fire here and closely examine all use of force incident reports filed since the adoption of that new policy as well.
And I just want to point out, too, that the point of this investigation is not to draw attention to APD and force them to reform or come up with reform policies. There is no police department in the United States that has undergone more and more intensive reform than the Albuquerque Police Department. As we write in today's essay that we published, if reform could work at all, it would work in Albuquerque, which is arguably the most reformed police department in the United States. I mean, no one could claim that their department in their city has undergone more waves of reform over the years. Particularly since the last 6 years, APD has operated under a court-approved settlement agreement that has forced it to prove that is reformed along like 278 different areas. And as Ernesto's research points out, and as our analysis of the reports filed by the Independent Monitor demonstrate, Mayor Keller's claims that APD is making progress is not true. We see it from what people tell us on the street.
They are making progress in the sense of being better
hiding
clerics.
Yeah, no, they hide it better. I mean, they literally are learning how to operate under intense scrutiny to continue to do things. And our conclusion is not this reform doesn't work, let's have a better one. Our conclusion is reform doesn't work because it's not calibrated to work. Reform is actually about restoring the legitimacy of police so they can continue to operate this way, which is what police is designed to do. I mean, all the evidence anyone could ever want proves reform doesn't work, and police use violence to impose an order that serves the interests of property holders, that serves the interests of a wealthy, few at the expense of the many. And yet that evidence is ignored by police reformists like Mayor Keller and others who pretend like it's working.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ernesto, for this. And there's a lot to dig in. I have some more questions about it, but I think we should move on to Selinda. And Selinda, can you introduce yourself, who you are, and the work that you've done with Millions for Prisoners, the Free Them All Coalition, and then also how this work has impacted you personally, especially with the Free Clifton White campaign, and who Clifton is, and maybe for folks who don't know who that is, you can maybe talk about his case.
Yes, thank you. I'm a bit of a busybody, so I just kind of want to shout out all of my groups that I organize with. Real quick, Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, which is also an IWOC chapter. We are the IWOC chapter for the entire Southwest. Save the Kids from Incarceration. It's a national ending school to prison pipeline group that organizes across the nation with 18 chapters in big cities across the United States. Building Power for Black New Mexico, which was the original Black Lives Matter New Mexico chapter about 6 years ago. We recognized that we didn't want to be just about public grieving. We wanted to do work with our community to build power, and we rebranded ourselves. And also to separate ourselves from the agendas of others. We wanted to be really deliberate in our work and intentional. So Building Power for Black New Mexico, which is a coalition of Black organizers here. There's also a newly formed group, Movement for Black Lives, here in New Mexico doing work with a sort of like a food justice, agricultural perspective for rural communities. And then, of course, we're in the Free 'em All Friday Coalition, and we are also holding Albuquerque Mutual Aid, where we've been providing mutual aid to central New Mexico, from Jemez Pueblo to Sucre, Santa Fe, to Belen, to Los Lunas, Edgewood, Sandia Park. We've gone all over the place. Our volunteers are absolutely phenomenal. And we have some 90 volunteers now doing this work for mutual aid, and it's a for the community, by the community effort, and is just absolutely so powerful. We have helped over 14,000 individuals since the beginning of pandemic get the things that they need just to make it from day to day. And we've gone from unsheltered communities, people who are quarantined in hotels, all the way to privileged neighborhoods with gates in the Northeast Heights. We just understand that when people reach out, that we can build with them, and it doesn't matter who they are. We want to build with all of our community, and it's just such a beautiful network of people. It is literally everybody. It's young, it's old, it's LGBTQ, it's trans, it's Black, it's Indigenous, it's just everybody, and it's beautiful. We also have a community defense group. We operate more under the radar, but that's what I think a lot of our videos have been going viral lately, so I just want to shout out. We do have a cop watch team, we have legal observers, we have community defense groups, we have folks who do restorative and transformative justice on the ground, and we have an entire coalition who we're all cross-trained in different skill sets to be able to hold that work in community. These are the things, and then the political education branch, right? Like, we do lots of workshops and readings and make things accessible to folks and talk to our people, and masses of one-on-ones is really what the organizing work looks like. And this is us building the world that we want to live in. Abolition has very little to do with the systems themselves. It has everything to do with building the societies that don't need them. And that's what abolition is about. So many people miss, you hate the police. You hate, this is not about hatred for the police, although I have a lot of animosity because of the violence and trauma that they've caused me, my family, and people I love, and my community. But This is not about hatred. Literally, our values are to lead with love and stand in our courage. This is what we live by. And so all of these things that I've just shouted out are us building the world that we want to live in. Access to education, access to people having food, access to diapers, access to transportation, access to safety with each other. And those are the things that we're working on. People often ask me about political agendas is in the realm of, when I talk about political education, just want to be really clear. We're talking about telling the truth about our history, being accountable and responsive to racial capitalism, understanding how to decolonize our communities and helping to hold that and that trauma that happens when people are decolonizing. I'm not talking about the Democratic Party. I'm not talking about, the orange monster in the office. I'm talking about on the ground truth telling, decolonization, getting back to our indigenous roots, back to how our people lived before they were colonized, and helping us all to build that community that does not need those colonized systems that profit from our bodies. Often I get asked about how I feel about that. Now, I do feel like I'm a precinct chair and I'm on the SCC. And I do these things. I ran the right to vote bill in 2019. I do these things as a tactic. It's absolutely necessary that we provoke it at every stage to help people become conscious. It is very, very difficult work to go and have to provoke that system. But I think that it's really important work for people who have the capacity and energy to be in those rooms. I know in 2019, when I ran that bill and I was sitting at the table next to Gail Chasey, and she was allowing me to be a truth teller in those committee rooms. And some of the people from my coalition said, "How are you doing? We know this is really hard." And I said, "It's like standing directly in the face of racism." And they said, "You're not just standing, you're leaning in." And I had to really think about that. I did go there as a provocateur. I never believed that I would have a bill. I never believed I'd have a sponsor, a bill number, or even make it through the first committee. And we made it all the way to the end of session. And that bill was absolutely a tactic to provoke the conversations around all of these topics. And we got tremendous support from Demos, who they're a national group who helped to support some of this work. But I did, in listening to some of the other intros, I just wanted to offer this. This was in 2019 from their letter, because statistics are so hard to come by here. But I do want to acknowledge that our Black community, there's arguments of whether we're 2 or 3%. And I do want to just acknowledge. So I am an Afro-Latina Indigenous woman who is also LGBTQ. So I just want to acknowledge my identity when I'm having this conversation as well. But we don't know if we're 2 or 3% Black. This argument goes across the state. But what it says is New Mexico has not been immune from the national illness of deep racial disparities. The imprisonment rate for Latinos in the state is 422 per 100,000, is more than twice that for whites, which is 208 per 100,000. The imprisonment rate is a staggering 1,326 per 100,000 for Black New Mexicans, 6.4 times the rate for whites. This is therefore not surprising that although the state population is about 2% Black, about 6.5% of its disenfranchised voters are Black. And so I just wanted to call that out, because these numbers, I also do work in Louisiana and in Alabama. And our numbers in New Mexico are comparable, right on track per capita with Louisiana and Alabama. But because it's such a small population here, it's like a genocide on our community. Not that it's not in those other communities, but we are living Jim Crow law. The idea that you can't stand at a store, that you can't be at a park in the middle of the day. I was cop watching and the police came and were kicking people out of the park on a Friday afternoon, unsheltered community who were sitting trying to get cool under a tree. And we were there distributing water, and APD pulled up and started to kick everybody out of the park, started to steal their things. And so this idea that you could be trespassing in a public park on a Friday afternoon speaks so much to the two-class society that we live in. Jim Crow law is active here in New Mexico. We just don't call it that. There is an underclass who is disenfranchised, who is not allowed in specific places. We're not allowed to drive in certain neighborhoods. We're not allowed to be present in certain places. And so I think we have to call these systems what they are. These are the tools of racial capitalism that have always been waged against us since this country came here with genocide and slavery. And that is what we are working to dismantle. We are working to decolonize and deconstruct the rhetoric of what they call these systems. My husband, Clifton, is in Los Lunas prison right now. And I always say he's on a plantation. It is not different. He is on a plantation. There is a plantation owner in the state. That's the person who is responsible for all the bodies that are on all the plantations in this state. Like, I think that we have allowed the society to use language against us and to convince us to sustain our own oppression. And so our young people will say, oh, I know what a plantation, I learned about slavery. I learned about the Pueblo Revolt. I learned about the things that happened to my ancestors. But then they change the name of what we call them today, and so they can't readily recognize that these same oppressions are still at play, that the same tools are being used right now. And so I think it's important also for us to acknowledge state violence for what it is, call things what they are, but also acknowledging, like, the southeast of Albuquerque. I live in your neighborhood now. I'm down the street now off Broadway, but I grew up in that neighborhood on South Broadway in the 90s. And I all up and down through the valley and all the way up to the war zone. I was there when we got our name War Zone. I stayed on Chama and Zuni back then. And so I just think about all the statistics that have been called out and just how much that impacts us, how much we live that every day. I was thinking about the registrations. I hosted a family from Navajo Nation at my home in Nob Hill when I was living there recently before we were evicted. And her car didn't have registration, but she parked on the street in our neighborhood on Wellesley. And APD came through 6 cars, and they were ticketing people for not having a registration. And so when I engaged with the sergeant and I confronted him about it, and I said, why would you be spending your resources doing this? You're manufacturing crime. This is not a crime. This is administrative. Like, this is not a crime that her car was legally parked, but her tag was out of date. Like, you came out of your way to our neighborhood with 6 units, all assigned to just do this.
And there's no way they can claim that there's any public safety benefit to that.
He called it community policing.
That's what it is.
He said,
another word for community policing is counterinsurgency.
The Southeast Command Sergeant told me that this was community policing. And I said,
that's what Mayor Keller assures we need more of.
According to, we do, in our work, the piece we're going to be publishing just this week, according to the Department of Transportation, there's no measurable impact to public safety or roads or safer roads to the kind of enforcement you're talking about, Selinda. So that if that's not the reason, then what is it? And it's what you're talking about, right? It's about intimidation. It's about imposing an order on poor people of color.
And that's what I shared with him. He said, it's just a $30 ticket. I said, this is a family that can't even afford a hotel right now. Their mother is in the ICU at UNMH. They're sleeping at my house because they don't have hotel money. That $30 is their gas back to Navajo Nation. Like, why would you think that they just have $30 to just give you because you chose to come and terrorize our neighborhood this morning? This is ridiculous. And that is the manufacturing of crime, because what happens when she can't pay it, and then she's back at home, and then a warrant pops up in the system, and she's driving in McKinley County and gets arrested, and then has to be in jail till the out-of-county police come and pick her up to bring her back for a light, like an expired tag that was at her house. She just hadn't put it on yet because she was here with her mom at the ICU and wasn't home to get her mail. And, and this is the conversation I had with him. And this happens every single day. The family that we were cop watching the other afternoon on Gibson and University, they took her car because she didn't have registration and insurance. And I said, but you have discretion. And he said, yes, my discretion is to take the car.
And so just to clarify, though, I thought that they had suspended stopping people for registration and insurance because of COVID-19.
They absolutely did. The governor even did it, included it in her press conference. I showed him the links. The other disconnect is the layers of policing, right? We have federal sting operations. We've got federal CIs all over our neighborhoods. We have state police, BCSO, APD, Homeland Security, ICE,
Let's jump into this, because I think this is a good,
this is a tremendously important qualifier to throw out there, because all the data that we are gathering just focuses on APD, and it has to be understood in the context of, in numerous other acting agencies. So when I went even through the traffic stop citations, there were hundreds of BCSO traffic stops, state police traffic stops that I just passed over that were happening in Albuquerque, making it into Metro Court because of my focus on APD. But it's an important,
Yeah, they're all over the place from multiple agencies and multiple jurisdictions. Yeah.
Well, I mean, even New Mexico itself is like the training ground for federal officers, like in Artesia. Like that's what that whole complex is there for. Border Patrol, BIA officers from Bureau of Indian Affairs,
right?
Like that's where they send everybody. And what I think we should talk about, though, is like this incident that Selinda had just mentioned, because Mayor Keller and the feds are saying that Operation Legend is not operational in a city like Albuquerque, but let's talk about the evidence that says otherwise. And if we want to begin with this case, and then maybe some of other examples that David and others have, because this case is interesting. Holly Holmes is involved. It's a true story. So maybe you can talk about this case with this family who was pulled over. Her car was impounded. Her husband was taken away. They actually raided her home afterwards. Actually tweeted about it. We were on our way to get chicken sandwiches at KFC. And we just passed by it and we're like, what the hell is going on? We actually thought it was a militia protest because there were two...
Where they show up?
Yeah, there were two FBI agents who were dressed in plain clothes but wearing camo flak jackets. And I actually thought they were armed militia. And I was like, oh shit, they're actually acting like police right now. But they were surrounded by... There was Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office there. APD was there. There were state troopers there. There were unmarked vehicles that were there. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you want to just walk us through that case, and then we can talk about Operation Legends, boots on the ground in Albuquerque.
Yeah. So what I was speaking to is all of the layers of policing that we deal with, and I want to also say CYFD. I know people don't readily recognize CYFD as being state violence, but they absolutely are. The stealing of our children has always been used as a tool against us. The stealing of children at the border is absolutely part of racial capitalism.
CYFD is
Children, Youth, and Families Department, which is responsible for the entire system that removes children from their families, and also manages the juvenile justice system. Justice system, right? Yes. Everything is so oxymoronic in the United States. Homeland Security is another one. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. They actually wrote about Free 'em All Fridays. I think we could talk about that another time. But I know that we keep hearing denials that this is a real thing, that this is happening. We've had the governor and the mayor both do public statements saying this is not a real thing, it's not happening. But we also have our county sheriff who went to go meet in Washington, D.C., promoting what is happening here. So yes, there's lots of confusion for the general public who's receiving this information about, wow, is it happening, is it not? Yes, it's happening. Yes, it's been here for a long time. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's been a period that I remember that there weren't feds in my neighborhood. All the way back to being a young person and being stopped and my picture taken on the side of the road when I was a teen. There has always been feds in our neighborhoods. Always, always, always. Veterans for Peace shared a number with me recently that Homeland Security spends $1.7 billion with a B just in Bernalillo County. Just in Bernalillo County. And that's all of the federal enforcement that happens just in this county.
They also have a headquarters here near the Air Force or the airport. Yeah, we actually had one of our Native Liberation conferences right next to the DHS office.
Yeah. So people might remember in 2016 I rallied against the attack on my neighborhood then when Damon Martinez, who was then the U.S. attorney, brought a racially driven federal sting operation to our city that attacked the Black community. So this has not been new work for us. We've been in this fight for a long time. And that's why we recognize the feds when they're in our neighborhoods and we confront them. I do want to say that also we have information, and we were able to prove it on our Cop Watch video the other night, that both BCSO and APD received federally funded positions where there are feds working inside those agencies right now. And so for Keller to say that this is not happening while he received federal money and positions into his department, it's crazy to have a mayor that won't even tell us the truth. And so in the Cop Watch video the other night, I actually we were on Gibson going to get dinner, me and the kids, and I saw all of the federal agents attacking this car. So I pulled over and I hopped out and started to Cop Watch and started to call comrades out to come and support the scene, because there was about 30 units when I first arrived. The entire 7-Eleven gas station was locked down with police. All kinds of agencies, BCSO, state police, and federal. Most of them at the beginning of the scene were FBI. As soon as I started filming them, they started to peel back because a lot of them were working in the capacity of CIs and undercovers. So they were plainclothed. Some of them had masks on or beanie, those caps where you just can, where you can just see the eyes. But they did certainly had their vests on that said FBI across the chest. And one of them showed up in a BCSO vehicle and had his FBI vest on the seat. So he's the one we were confronting about, because he's the one who made the decision to take the woman's car. He had made a statement to her, and he said, if you give me access to your house, I won't take your car. And so she said, do you have a warrant? And he said, oh, I see, I have to take your car. Mm. And so that's when he proceeded to begin to take the car.
Yeah, but he also he had no reason to take the car, but he created a crime scene with crime scene tape. As the way when I was seeing it, I was like, why are they putting up a crime scene tape?
Because we had a standoff. Yeah. And it was more symbolic to show that we were going to defend our community. So her husband and her 4-year-old were in the vehicle when they attacked the car. They shattered the window with the baby in the car. And he wasn't even resisting. Yeah. He went with them. He knew he had a warrant. He went with them. And he did not combat them at all. But they still brought this level of violence to this woman and child because they wanted access to her apartment. We learned later on when our folks went to go help her clean up, there was masses of evidence of surveillance that was being done on their apartment. They found some of those static bags up around. They pulled off her heater off her wall. just extensive damage to her apartment. They completely ransacked it. But they really wanted access to the apartment. They were trying to get in her apartment before the traffic stop. So they showed up, the FBI showed up at her house, and they were in plain clothes. They would not identify themselves, and they were banging on the door. And she said, "Who are you?" And they just yelled out, "FBI." She said, "What's your badge number? What's your agency? Give me your card." They wouldn't reveal themselves. And so she said no, they didn't let them in. And they ended up leaving. And then later on, when they drove down to the gas station, that's when they came and attacked the car. And so they were still trying to get access into the house. And they ended up, after they took her car, they went there, and that's when they ran through her house. And the Holly Holmes piece is interesting because as our community defense team was out there working to support her, like, you know, what can you do except for film the damage in a situation like this when you have multi-agencies tearing apart community members' home? And that's what was happening. And they were doing tactics at the scene, like shining a big bright light onto the people so that their cameras couldn't film them. So they were doing all these different tactics, and they were working in coalition with the neighbors, trying to get the neighbors engaged to cooperate with the police against the ones that were out there filming. And Holly Holmes showed up to that apartment complex for like a booty call or a visit or something with somebody. It's like the middle of the night. It's like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And people were like, "Hold on, who is that? Why are you here?" You know, it's just very strange. But they were there until late in the evening. And then she has cats, and she was worried that her cats were gonna get out, and she would lose her pets also in this. And so they stayed until the scene was cleared, and then they were able to close up her apartment. And they've gone back now and helped her clean up, and we're working today to help her get her car back. But this is all the community coming together. This is people donating to help this family through this crisis of state violence. They threatened to call CYFD on her. They took her car. And so that manufacturing of crime that happens against families, that's what state violence looks like for us. And that's how oppressed our communities are, is, that especially if you're not networked, who would you call? She was just bawling at the scene, and she just said, "I can't even believe you guys came and helped me with this." She said, "I just felt so alone. It's only me and my mom here. I didn't have anybody else to call." And we were trying to persuade her, force them to just release her car. She needed her vehicle. It's her only transportation. So it was more symbolic with us in community defense to say, we will defend our community. So we stood all around the tow truck, and we just were holding the tow truck from leaving, and trying to tell BCSO, just release her car. You don't have to do this. Telling the tow truck driver, you don't have to be complacent and do you don't have to just do your job. You could do something different right now. And calling out and calling attention and letting people see that, like, we will continue to resist. And so BCSO told us that we were on private property and that we had to leave. And I said, no, we know our rights. 7-Eleven didn't tell us to leave. We're not trespassing. And so they sent a BCSO officer inside to try to persuade 7-Eleven to kick us out for trespassing. And they said no. And so they came back. And so that's when they got that yellow crime scene tape out. And they created a fake crime scene all around us. They tied the yellow tape all around us.
They were the one that damaged the car.
They did all of the violence, and they created this fake crime scene to say that we were interfering in a crime. We were interfering in a crime scene, and that we would be arrested if we didn't move. And so that was their tactic to finally steal her car.
And then at the end of the day, though, like he was released on an ROR, released on his own recognizance.
The very next day.
Because the charges weren't even that serious.
Well, the judge ROR'd him at his arraignment, and so it's just really interesting, that it took 30 federal officers to bring him in, haul him into the county jail to go to court to be ROR'd.
Yeah.
And so he probably could have been summoned again or something, right? And maybe he would have been able to comply. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for the family, but what we're talking about though is we're talking about things that are not crimes.
Right.
He wasn't actively hurting somebody. He wasn't robbing somebody. He wasn't there wasn't the violence that came through via state violence, via people that we pay their salaries, and we are paying for our own oppression. And so much of what I saw that day and what inspired me to, I couldn't leave. My kids were in the car with our dinner, and they were just sitting over there for an hour and a half. But my own family goes through this. And so, this scene looked very similar to scenes that happened when my husband was kidnapped. And, I just think that we always, 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 even when it's uncomfortable, we have to stand on the side of justice for our community. We have to stand on the side of what is right, because people need to be protected in these conditions. And it's only getting worse. Fascism is all the way risen to power. And we're at a pivotal point. I think that in 50 years from now, people are going to write about what was happening at this time in the society and decisions that people made. And I try to always talk to decision makers in the society about, where do you think your legacy will be? What are they going to say about you in 50 years? Where will you be standing? Will you be standing with the people, or will you be standing with the oppressor? And what do you need your legacy to be? Who are you actually in your core? Who are your values? And that's what makes me an abolitionist, is that, it's the understanding that policing was born from slave catchers. It's the understanding that the profit that comes from modern day slavery, the understanding of how Jim Crow law plays out in our society right now. And, that felons are absolutely operating under Jim Crow law, like all of those rules that got put in, the idea that you can't buy life insurance when you're a felon, that you can't live in certain places, you can't work in certain places, you sometimes can't be housed with your own family. That's happening to us now. The Department of Corrections told my husband, who's state property, that whenever he gets out of prison again, he won't be permitted to have any contact with me or come home. Because they say that I'm detrimental to his success in the society, which is ludicrous, because we're his family, we're his only support. And so these are the same tools that they've always used. They've always separated families. That is absolutely how they crush us and control us.
ICE. Every police
agency, every agency does it. Yes.
And so let's shift gears a little bit. We're running on an hour right now, and maybe we can wrap up with talking about Operation Legend and its connection to the Albuquerque Police Department, but also somebody like Mayor Keller, who is a liberal, and he fashions himself as a reformer, and where in other places in other cities, Democratic mayors are offering tepid kind of defunding the police packages, very anemic, let's slash 0.5% or let's slash 1% of like $1 billion police budget, whereas Mayor Keller is like, no, let's not do this at all. Let's actually fund the police and create more community policing. And the story that you shared, I think, really ties into a lot of the work that David and I and others have worked on, looking at what we call border town violence. You talked about the plantation economy that was created and basically spread westward, from the eastern seaboard, and we would call that in an indigenous vernacular, these are border towns. These are white-dominated colonial settlements that police indigenous life on or off the reservation. In this case, making it difficult for even a family to come visit its own relative within the ICU unit or the hospital, but also how a city like Albuquerque cannot actually physically expand because it's completely surrounded by a mountain on one side and four pueblos, and if you include the Navajo Nation and Tahajale as well, that it's literally surrounded by reservation land. And that often doesn't get talked about in the conversation of police and its relationship with, indigenous people. But the research that APD or Abolish APD has conducted, shows that, the police, do what are called 9-mile rides. Is that what that's called? Or
yeah, it's a rough ride, but the Albuquerque version of the rough ride is we're calling it the 9-mile ride because they snatch people off the street, cuff them, drive erratically, injuring them along the way as they're ricocheting in the car, and then they dump them in 9 Mile Hill, right by the volcanoes. And I since we wrote that piece last week, I talked to one other woman on the street who couldn't talk about her 9 Mile ride because it was too painful. Yeah. And I wasn't about to push her on that, but so that's a common tactic. And I mean, let's talk a little bit about Operation Legend in the time we have left. And because I want to
let's do what APD does, or Abolish APD does, and let's combine the narrative with the actual data that you've collected on Operation Legend.
Well, the story that Selinda told is a perfect illustration of Operation Legend as it's happening on the ground, which from what we've been able to piece together through sources, it seems to have sort of two prongs to it. The first is, well, let's just back up a second, and I'm sure my dates are going to be wrong. But so the federal government, when they announced Operation Legend, sort of vaguely connected it to Operation Relentless Pursuit, which was also a federal operation in just a few select cities around the country, which included Albuquerque, which began at the turn of the year, December-ish before that. And but the federal government says they suspended all of that because of the pandemic, and in particular, some reporting in Albuquerque, really bad reporting by the Albuquerque Journal, claims that the reason it suspended it here in Albuquerque was because APD refused to submit to one of the key issues that the federal government required, which was that you cooperate with ICE. And Mayor Keller claims that, we're a sanctuary city, and so there's no cooperation with ICE. And so that was one of the reasons why they claimed Operation Relentless Pursuit is sort of dormant, and we need this thing called Operation Legend, which I guess it was late July that Trump identified Albuquerque as one of the cities that they would send federal agents to. And the claim is major crimes investigations, sending a surge of federal troops into cities to assist local police departments or sheriff's departments in closing out open major crimes investigations. Almost immediately after Trump made that announcement, Mayor Keller announced, we don't have anything to do with it. We're not going to cooperate. I have no knowledge of it. And he directed his deputy city attorney to write a letter to the U.S. attorney in Albuquerque saying, we don't want this. We don't want what's happening in Portland here. We don't want your federal officials, your federal agents here. We will not cooperate. And this was, I think that was late July, if I'm not mistaken. But from our investigation, all of that is a lie. Everything the Department of Justice claims Operation Legend is not accurate. And everything that Mayor Keller has said about Albuquerque's role or knowledge in it is not accurate. We have two sources on the street. Let's just start with what Operation Legend actually is. Most of the effort by the 35 federal agents, who are all, by the way, staying at the Doubletree Hotel downtown, is solely undercover drug and gun buys on the street. They're not investigating major crimes that are open. They are trying to induce unsheltered folks on the street into selling them drugs or guns. It is an insane way to go about doing anything because everyone on the street knows everyone else on the street, and they immediately identify federal agents. And we talked to one woman who said a guy came up, young guy with a really nice bike, trying to buy drugs from her. And she said, none of the drugs, he didn't look like the kind of guy who'd been taking the kind of drugs he wanted. And moreover, they started messing with him and said, give us your bike and we'll get you the drugs. And he wouldn't. And she said, well, if he was a drug addict, he'd have given us the bike. Yeah. We talked to another source on the street who told us the pattern of APD harassment in the part of town we talked to him in had literally stopped the minute agents came to town. Mm-hmm. So that, in other words, APD backed off and federal agents moved in. They were working in teams of 2 or 3. They would be by themselves in the street, but there were folks that they could identify as support staff. A couple of times, this source told us that they blew their cover on the street. And when that happened, APD would move in and diffuse and get them off the street. We confirmed through reviewing 2 of the criminal complaints that have been filed related to Operation Legend that there is close coordination, not just between the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, which you mentioned, Selinda, is on record cooperating with Operation Legend, but there's close coordination with the Albuquerque Police Department. In fact, the first arrest made as part of Operation Legend was by a ATF agent named Charles Dubois, certainly no relation to WEB, I would guess, who was a 12-year veteran of APD before joining ATF. And it was a gun-related or felony gun-related arrest based on a prior APD warrant that had been issued by APD. Issued by the courts, but on an APD arrest. And he worked closely with a homicide detective named Jose Lucero, APD detective. So this is an APD detective working with an ATF agent affecting an arrest under Operation Legend. Keller claims APD is not involved, not cooperating. He says they don't know anything about it. That's not true.
Mid-July. The criminal complaint details how this coordination was happening beginning in mid-July between this ATF officer, former APD officer, and APD.
Yeah, the APD part of it begins in June, and ATF's involvement begins before even Trump announces they're sending agents to Albuquerque. So in other words, there were agents in Albuquerque before the Fed said they'd be here. They were working with APD before Keller claims he knew nothing about it and his officers were not cooperating. And they're also not doing any major drug or crime investigation. They're actually trying to induce people into committing crimes rather than investigating any open crimes. We have 2 sources that have been telling us about what the standard operating procedures are in the street related to these gun and drug buys. And we have been able to confirm with one person with close knowledge of both APD and federal investigations in Albuquerque that this is standard to all federal investigations in Albuquerque. You mentioned this earlier, Selinda, that there have always been federal agents in Albuquerque. And our source not only confirmed that, but said, if the feds are involved, it is undercover inducements, entrapment to try to, arrest people on these sort of like bogus, drug and gun buys on the street. And so they're arresting people who don't even have drugs or guns, but are just on the street, who usually would be harassed by APD, but now the feds are there. So, there's no evidence whatsoever that they're engaging in any serious drug and gun investigations or helping APD or BCSO close any of those out.
It's all very similar to what the tactics that Damon used in 2016. These were exactly the same things that he was doing in our community in 2016. Yeah. And if you recall, we did a whole protest with Tim Keller the very first year that he was elected, because he actually, if you remember, broke a campaign promise that year 1, and he raised our taxes to give money to APD that very first year. Yeah. And he gave Damon Martinez a 6-figure position as soon as our taxes got raised. And it's a politically appointed position, not one that you would have to fill out an application for. It was a political favor. And now we have Damon Martinez, who has proven to be dangerous and racially motivated in his policing, as the top cop in APD. And of course we were going to see this repercussion. This is exactly what we said would happen when he hired Damon Martinez back then. And he defended his hire back then, and he continues to defend it today. And it's like when you take the U.S. attorney, who has been pretty much the top cop for the feds, is really what their job is here, is to prosecute federal cases here and work to assist on federal sting operations, and you put him as the top cop at APD, what would you expect except for the same tactics to be unfolding here? More federal agents coming, more federal monies coming, more cooperation with the feds. And that's what we've seen in our community, is it's much worse under this mayor than it was under Barry.
Yeah.
And I'm no fan of Barry. Barry was horrific when it came to these issues as well. But
Barry was more like incompetent when it came to like law enforcement, whereas like Mayor Keller seems very competent.
He's very,
and like very committed to like policing itself.
Strategic and in the narrative that he presents to the community, he's able to play both sides and speak out both sides of his mouth.
He's unapologetically committed to increasing the funding, of which he has done every year since he's been in office, and increasing the number of officers on the ground. I mean, he's celebrates
a tough on crime.
Every time he's spoken. In the last couple months, he celebrated the addition of 200 more officers and how they're committed to adding 200 more still yet.
And celebrating at like Black Lives Matter rallies.
Yeah.
He will like actually speak and be like, actually, I've done a really good job at reforming the police by increasing our community policing like profile within the community. And obviously, we know
I just want to say that those were not Black Lives Matter rallies.
Well,
those are
under the auspices of.
Yeah. So there's, and again, it's the same tools that we've always seen, where they get people who look like us to stand up there as their tokens to say, "Oh, we love the police."
Yeah.
We love the police. What do you mean? We're not opposed to the police. We want, and they have hug-a-thons with the police intentionally, and then they take money behind the scenes so that they could be that. I got called by the U.S. attorney, the current U.S. attorney, in December, right after Barr made the announcement. They reached out to me, the U.S. attorney's office, and asked me for a meeting. I took comrades from the community with me so I could have witnesses and not be alone. I went and sat with them from the U.S. attorney's office, and he basically said, this operation that's coming for the 7 cities has a lot of money in it. He said the one thing that's positive about this presidency is they do believe in states' rights, so we do have some wiggle room about how we're going to spend the money. He said we will be doing enforcement, but we do have some money available. And he offered me money. He offered me money, and he offered me to give him, he asked if I could give him names of people who are doing direct service work in the grassroots in our community and who could do this. And so it was really interesting because right after I listened to him, and then I said, and we left, and then he kept email, and I blocked him on my email. And I didn't, because that's not what we would do. But it's interesting that, I don't want to call deliberately people out, but there are people in the international district, nonprofit organizations, and people doing direct services work who are receiving federal money, who are receiving state crime money, who look like us.
But this is what
we can talk about Roots, Kathy McGill's group right now. I love Kathy. But Patrick Barrett goes there. They brought the police to the kids 2 weeks ago to have breakfast with the kids. And they keep bringing police, and they're getting money. They're getting money from these groups. Endorphin Power, he got the job at APD, and he reports to the chief now. How dangerous is that to have an addiction, unsheltered services directly in the heart of the southeast of Albuquerque, whose director is working for APD?
Yes, a police front. I mean,
this is dangerous for our community. These are people who our community is supposed to be able to trust.
Yeah.
And it continues to happen. We continue to see them show themselves. Tay Berry, Frankie Grady, we just continue. Right. They keep on showing up, and they're people who look like us, who claim to be doing work in our communities, but they won't call themselves abolitionists. So anybody listening, know your organizer, know their values, know what they're standing on, know what they're organizing for. Know where the money comes from.
But this is like how the police normalize themselves. It's not that, like, so for example, in Rapid City has a notorious like police force. They used a state highway patrol officer to sick an attack dog on an unarmed homeless Native man recently that should have went viral but never did. They deployed a tank against a 14-year-old who was suspected of like stealing a bicycle. And what does their community policing look like? The Native community cannot get money to have a community garden, so the police, the Rapid City Police Department steps in and say, "Hey, we'll give you money for this." The question that I have, and even in these situations, is like, why the fuck is the police writing the checks for these things?
Right.
And it's because, as what David said earlier, it's a counterinsurgency campaign against communities. No. It's enforced scarcity of, like, if you listen to police scanners in the city, 90% of calls are for mental health issues or housing issues. 90%.
Right.
Why the fuck are the police showing up for housing? Why are they showing up for, they justify their own existence. They're like, oh, now we have to be crisis management. It's like, no, a police officer should not. We don't want you to be that. Yeah, we don't want you to be that.
To do that.
So it's like, they say that it's community policing, but there's no community consent around the services that they're trying to insert themselves into. And now they're co-opting people who are actually doing those services.
And it's a way for them to create more confidential informants in our community. Last summer, when Michelle Lujan Grisham sent state police to the southeast of Albuquerque, the kids from Van Buren, some of the families said that their kids walking home from school were getting stopped by state police and fingerprinted at the vehicles, and they were asking them to tell on people in their neighborhood. They were asking them to be informants.
Was that the Metro Surge or whatever?
I don't know what she called it. I don't remember. But they're still here. They never went away. And she said that she pulled them back, but they're not. We have so many state police in our neighborhood. And it has not stopped. And Malcolm X Day last year, we had to kick them out of the park. Yeah. They came and they wouldn't allow our community to come to the park.
So for people that don't know and who are listening to this, I've only been stopped by state police in this state. And some of them actually look like military men because they show up, they have fatigues, they have like flak jackets. They look like, they don't look like cops. I mean, not that like we have to make cops look like cops, but I was actually confused. I was like, wait, what agency are you, a Fed or whatever? But they're like probably the most militarized branch of law enforcement in this state, minus like Border Patrol and the federal agencies.
And they're all showing up that way now. Yeah. When we organized the first street protest for Black Lives Matter after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis for solidarity, and I intentionally chose to have it on Wyoming and Central because our plan was to go back and forth to Copper because for people that didn't know, Relentless Pursuit was stationed at the Armory on Copper in Wyoming, and each evening at dusk, you could just see the feds rolling out of there into the neighborhood in all of their unmarked cars. And so we chose that because it's literally the heart of state violence. And so that's why we chose that location for the very first protest that we did. That evening, at the end of the protest, after everything finally shut down and was wrapping up, some young women came and pulled up to us at the McDonald's, and they said, there's 4 kids on the ground and the police have AKs in their faces down the street. So we all activated Cop Watch. We went down to Mesilla and Central, and that's when we happened upon the scene that led to my husband's targeting, and now he's in prison. But they had a tank facing the kids on this side. The kids were pulled, their car was like this, and they had, I forgot how many we caught, 12 cars behind them, most of them unmarked. It absolutely was Relentless Pursuit. All of them were either in like full military fatigues, you can see it on our video, or they were in plain clothes with just a vest that said police on it. And we disrupted the scene. They took the kids, kidnapped them into the tank. As the tank backed up, they brought a wall of riot police to us to try to disperse. There was like 20 or 30 of us out there by that point. Who were trying to disrupt the scene. And they took the kids in the tank. We disrupted the scene. We had a standoff with the police that night. They shot tear gas at us, hit a community member in the belly with a canister. As we tended to them, we recognized that they left the kids' car there with the keys on the hood. So we checked the car out, and we knew we were going to look for the kids anyway. So we took possession of the kids' car. We didn't leave it out there on Mesilla and Central the way the police did. And we drove the car home. That's when APD surrounded my husband the first time. And this is what was the basis for his arrest that following Monday. But this is the same tactics that they continue to use. They are attacking us with tanks. They show up with full riot gear. They're using city buses and paratransit vehicles to transport police in, which is an absolute violation of the FTA. I worked for transit for a lot of years, and I used to go to the FTA conferences.
And during these protests and demonstrations, they'll often use UNM campus as a place to because that's where we're doing this interview right now. We're doing it on UNM campus, so the university is complicit in it. Absolutely. The city is complicit in it.
I would say university administrators are complicit in it. I think there are plenty of students, faculty, and staff
lots of people
who are standing up on behalf of their community.
The grad students have written letters opposing the presence of state, because there's a firearms ban on campus, but yet the state have been removed. Right. So let's pause here for a second, and let's actually, I think this is a good place to stop because there's a lot more that we can get into. And maybe we can pick this conversation up in like a part 2, a part 3, a part 4, because this is going to continue. But
can I say the call to action? Like I said, my husband is still on the plantation in Los Lunas, New Mexico, and we're still fighting for his freedom. The parole board has ruled against him, but parole is administrative. So there's no courts that have him in prison. He's considered state property. This is absolutely under the control of the governor. She could free him right now with the wave of her pen if she just decided and was willed to. She absolutely could. She's in control of DOC. She's in control of the parole board. She could absolutely make an executive order to free him, and just has not been compelled or moved to do so. So we are still activating calls to the governor, to Department Secretary Alicia Tafoya. He is on his 7th parole term, which this is a whole nother topic about how New Mexico uses parole to illegally enhance sentences here. And so he's still there, and he is, we don't know when he'll be home because they haven't even determined what his sentence would be. It's still at Central Managed CMIS for decision. And so we don't know how long it's going to be, but hopefully we can still compel her to free him. And so if people have the capacity, please call the governor, please send an email to the governor, tweet the governor, call her to free Clifton White.
Cool. And I'll put some more information about Clifton's case in the show notes. And so where can folks follow and find Abolish APD? And what's the best way that they can get involved?
You can find our 2 of our recent reports on our website, abolishapd.org. You could find us on Twitter or Facebook as well. I'm not sure when this will be posted, but by the time it's posted, we might have the first story based on the traffic investigation we're doing. And also by the time this comes out, we'll probably have published our first essay based on our investigation of Operation Legend, which is some of which is information that we've been able to get from the great work that Selinda's been doing, but also from sources we have on the street. And you can reach us. There's ways to reach us on the website or on Twitter or Facebook. Get a hold of us if you want to contribute or get involved. It's a growing organization. There's a lot to do. APD has 1,000 officers and more on the way, and almost a $250 million budget.
Right.
And
actually, I don't want to let that go. In their APD's budget presentation, just on July 14th, 2020, they reported $205 million for fiscal year 2019-2020. That's 1/3 of the general fund budget, and that's what Keller describes as totally underfunded.
So I used to help with the CAFR at the city with the CFO when I was there, and so that's also a manipulated number. So some of the departments like solid waste management, they are independently functioning. So they make their own money, they're self-sustaining, and they contribute money back to the general fund. to get the true impact of what APD is on the general fund budget, you have to take out those entities, the revenue producing ones. And then you will quickly see that I know when I worked for the city of Albuquerque, they had 87% of the city's general fund budget. This is the general fund budget that funds libraries, community centers, anything that is not self-sustaining. And so you have to take out those entities that make and bring their own money, and then you can see the true impacts of what they are grabbing out of the general fund. And it is a massive. And now they've just tried to get another 1 million scraped out of those departments, like Family and Community Services, to give to Black community, because whatever that means. You know, $1 million is nothing compared to the assault on the Black community. Like, what is that supposed to actually do? And then it's given to the token organizations who are out here doing pro-police work. Yeah, exactly. So it's the same thing as refunding the police over again.
Well, and not only that, but that Trojan horse of a proposal that Tim Keller made about a community safety department is not going to be funded out of money taken from APD, but likely, like what you just said, culled from other departments. So APD's budget will remain
inside of AP.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's an expansion. You know, I mean, every reform process anywhere in the United States always results in more cops, more money for cops, more weapons. And that's true in Albuquerque, just like anywhere else. And this is another example. His response to outrageous police violence and demands to defund APD are always more cops, more money for cops, and fake claims about reform fixing the problem.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I had to offer that.
No. I think that's a good place to end it, and that's a good conversation to begin the next time we all sit down together. So I really appreciate you all joining us today, and I'll put all of this stuff in the show notes. So thanks so much.